We're going to take probably just around an hour or just a little bit over an hour to spend some time reflecting and hearing some reflections on what has been discussed here today. So we have a terrific panel here with us. We haven't introduced you as yet to Dr. Stephen Cornell. Many of you will know him. I'm going to introduce him in much more detail tomorrow. Stephen is with the Native Nations Institute and was one of the co-authors of the Harvard Project on Indian Economic Development, a very extensive study that dealt with governance in Indian country and economic development. So he's going to talk to us first. He's been sitting back and listening to what's been said today. So I've asked each of our presenters here to spend about 5 or 10 minutes just reflecting back, and we'll sort of take it from there as to where we'll go after that. So welcome, Stephen. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Angela. Well, thanks. First, I just want to thank the BC Treaty Commission for including me in this discussion, and Angela for calling me up and asking if I'd be willing to come up here, and the Coast Salish peoples for the privilege of being in your country, your place. And I thank all of you for including me in this. I'm not an Indigenous person. I'm not even a Canadian. I am humbled to be in this group. And I'm humbled to share this podium with Sophie and Satsan. These are two people whom I've been privileged to know for some time now. I consider them among my teachers, and I mean that very seriously. I've learned a lot from both of them and from their peoples and from your struggles. So today has been to me like a master class in rebuilding nations. You have hit on so many core issues with so much perception and intelligence and passion, and I'm thrilled that this is being filmed because I hope someday to share some of it with other students. You are part of something that's happening around the world today, which is a revolution among Indigenous peoples reclaiming their place on the land, their power over their own lives, their right to be themselves. And the conversation you've had today I found inspirational. I thought what I would do, I've taken notes through the day. I don't want to just repeat everything you've heard, but there were some things which really stood out for me at almost every part of today, every moment of today, and I thought I would just cover what a few of them were. And I begin with something I thought that Satsan talked about this morning when he talked about the need to slay the monster, and it reminded me of something that gets talked about these days in psychology circles called learned helplessness. And that's part of what colonialism does. It's very skilled. It's a very talented system, and it teaches people to be helpless. And part of what you are doing is trying to move people beyond that. And this is where things like education come in. The Satsan talked about the need to know your history. How did we come to where we are today? Why did my uncle have to go through that? Why did he behave that way? You know your history and you suddenly begin to understand yourself and your own personal history and your family's history and why things are hard, and you also begin to see what needs to change. So I just think that's a really important part of the whole nation rebuilding process. I remember an Anishinaabe man, leader of the Odawa people in Michigan, who once said to me, "Boy, we've gotten to the point where we don't need an oppressor. We're too good at doing it to ourselves." We kind of internalize so many of these things. And I think that's, in a way, that's where the rebuilding process starts. It starts in people's heads. I also just, throughout the day, I was reminded, I was asked some years ago, because of the work we'd done at the Harvard Project, to testify before the Canadian Senate Committee on Aboriginal Affairs. And only a couple of senators actually showed up for this testimony. There were 4 of us testifying about different things, and I presented some of the research results of the Harvard Project. And I remember this one senator, and she said, "Why are we talking about these things? We know these nations won't even be here in 30 years. That's often been the mindset out there. You won't even be here. And I wish I had said the response because I thought it was the right response, but one of the four of us said, you know, we've been hearing that for about 2 centuries now. And, you know, stick around for 30 years and guess what? We'll be here. And everything that you've talked about today is part of the response to that idea. I very much appreciated John Jack talking about 5 democracies, but they all look different. Central governments want uniformity out there because it makes life easy. And to them, diversity is a problem. I think diversity is the solution. You get to be yourself. And so 5 democracies, all of which look different, that's a solution. That's nations coming alive. And it will always be the case that they'll look different because what nation rebuilding is about freedom to be yourself again, your collective self as a people. And that means you'll be different from others. The other thing that occurred to me listening to both Satsan and John Jack was there was a lot of talk today about citizens, and I love that word as a replacement for member. And I remember Oren Lyons from the Onondaga people who once said to me, "Are you a member of the United States?" He said, "At Onondaga, we're not a club. We don't have members. We're a nation. We have citizens." Well, if you have citizens, one of the things you have to think about is how do you make citizens? How do you turn that 3, 4, 5-year-old, 12-year-old, 15-year-old into the citizen you want who will become the protector and the sustainer and the participant in nationhood? And again, we're back to education and to nations taking charge of the education of their people. Why? Because you have to make citizens if nations are going to live. You have to have citizens who feel the obligation of citizenship, not the rights of membership, the obligations of citizenship. It's a very different thing. Catherine Tenise talked about we had constitutions, our laws, our institutions, and she talked about the system at Tinaja of the Tinaja nation and then the 4 communities, and she said it's not a hierarchy. They're partners. They're different pieces of a government. And I thought that was really important, that when we look at multi-community governance, it's not a matter of creating hierarchies, it's a matter of creating relationships and partnerships. And the questions become, okay, what will those look like? And obviously that's a complicated thing and it's going to be different across cases. But I very much appreciated also her sense that constitutionalism is an indigenous tradition. They may not have been written down, but you succeeded because people knew how they should behave. They knew who made decisions over what. You had your own laws and institutions. Those are constitutions. And I was reminded of an Australian elder. We've been doing some work in Australia recently with indigenous communities who, despite the fact that it's the other side of the world and a different history, face many of the same challenges that you do. And he said to us, he was talking about constitutions, and he said, you know, some people think constitutions are Western things. And then he said, you know, wolves have a constitution. And I think we must, there are 4 of us in the room, we must look mystified by this comment. And he said, no, think about it. He said, the wolf pack has rules. It has a distribution of responsibilities and roles. And when all the wolves follow the rules, the system works. That's a constitution. It's not a Western idea. It's something that makes the world work. And I thought that was an interesting way to think about a constitution. It's part of, in many ways, the natural order of things when it works well. I was fascinated by the Stolo presentation, How to Be Whole Again. I thought that was a wonderful line. How to be whole again. And especially when you are in this situation given to you by colonialism of dispersal, some people in this situation, some in something very different. They're small communities, they're large communities. How do you be whole again? And one thing is to realize is you don't all have to be in proximity to each other. You don't all have to be the same. That wholeness happens in your head. in the heart. It's about how people see themselves. Sophie, I love this line. Can your people see themselves reflected in their Constitution? Maybe that's the ultimate question about your Constitution. Do your people see themselves in it? The trouble with Indian Act constitutions and in my country, Indian Reorganization Act constitutions and all the rest of them is no indigenous nation sees themselves in those words. They were someone else's words, someone else's ideas. So I think that's a wonderful question to ask. And Sophie also remarked that good governance, capable governance, is your own tradition. It was what you did before the Europeans showed up and took that power away. And now you're reclaiming that power, and in a sense you're saying, hey, we governed well, we'll do it again. We're reclaiming that. Then just to finish in these discussions, at the end of the day, there were a number of things that people said I thought were very interesting. It's the nation that has power. We're talking a lot about governance at this forum, and I want you to just remember a First Nation government, an indigenous government, is a tool. It's simply an instrument that the nation uses to realize its dreams. When you create a government, it's not the government that matters. It's the nation that matters. And that was clear in a number of the discussions in your groups. I was very struck by it. And just to remind ourselves that all government is a tool. What ultimately matters is the nation. And the constitutional task is to say, what kind of tools do we need to achieve the dreams we have? Is the Indian Act a good set of tools for governing given what we're trying to achieve for our people? No, it's a terrible set of tools. Be done with it. Create the tools that'll do it for you. But remember, they're just tools. They're not what you're about. They're just a tool. I thought that was interesting about what do you write down. Not everything has to be written down. One of the nations I've done a lot of work with is a very traditional community in the southwestern United States. They're brilliant. They do wonderful things for their people. They fiercely defend their land and their ways of life. They have no written constitution. And I once said to, this was an important lesson for me, I said to one of the leaders of that nation, you don't have a constitution. He said, oh, yes, we do. It's written right here. It's written here. We learn it from the medicine people. We learn it from our elders. We learn it from our parents. We learn it growing up in this community. We carry our Constitution inside us. And you write it down because one thing colonialism has done is bring all these differences and divisions into communities. So some people are less connected than others. Some have to relearn it. The outside world now, if you're going to partner with them, they want to know how do you govern. So you have to write down what's necessary so that you all know this is how we do things, and so that that outsider who wants to partner with you knows this is who you are as a nation, and this is how you do things, and they gain that respect from knowing. But it doesn't have to be everything. There may be things that don't get written down because they don't need to be, and maybe they need to be protected inside your own people. I think I should let my colleagues here. I've had my say. Sophie.
Thank you, Stephen. It's always wonderful to listen to Stephen. And if you close your eyes, you don't realize that he isn't indigenous. I think that you spend so much time so immersed in our beliefs, our values, and in our lives that seriously, if you close your eyes, you think that it was an uncle or somebody talking, right? That's pretty cool. That's a compliment, by the way. Yeah, his Uncle Steve. Unfortunately, I missed Satsan's portion, but I'm glad it's been taped so I can see it later, because it sounds like it was pretty awesome. And I'm not surprised, it's the least I would expect. So I look forward to hearing. But I've picked up from different conversations some of the things that you were saying, and the facing down our dragons, I guess, continues to be something that that regardless of the sort of lot of the improvements and a lot of the progress that we make, that it's still there. It's what I was talking about when I said, how we spend so much time trying to get governments to recognize our title, to recognize us as people, and yet we take very little time to recognize each other. And I've listened to the discussions, the feedback from around the room here, and think that there continues to be a lot of work that we have to do. But I feel really, I feel comfortable, I feel confident, and I feel optimistic about the work that needs to be done because of you and what you're doing in your communities. I was really interested to listen to our group around the table there, and to listen to what a lot of the young people in particular are doing, to listen to how we're going to use technology to help us move forward. And we're thinking back to Malnuth, what you were saying this morning, and when with the whole presentation, and you're talking about the generations, the generation that's being born now, and I've got a 7-month-old granddaughter, and I'm thinking about all the things that she's going to grow up with, a total different reality for her compared to the reality for myself as her grandmother, and even for her father and her mother. But things that some of the difficulties that we still have in our communities around expectations that people have from leadership, from band offices, from nation offices. And yet, when Catherine and I were growing up, we didn't have a band office that we could go to and give complaints about. Those kinds of things are just so recent. So we're going to have this next generation growing up, not realizing that those types of things weren't around. And I think that it's important for us to continue to have the continuity of our story, so that our people always know that what they're experiencing now has been fought for. We've gone through a lot of difficult times in order to get where we are now, and that we're always going to be there supporting them as they go forward. I was rather intrigued and feeling again optimistic about what I heard from Joe Wild. And I think a lot of people in this room were, because it seems that at least an individual, an ADM, so it's got a bit of power, that he seems to be getting the message. He seems to be hearing us. I heard him say that they're not prepared to consult and then go back and write policy, that in fact they want to do it with us. So I hope that we aren't the ones that are going to fall down on that. That is an opportunity for us. It's also a challenge. That and I take him at his word, that there's this opportunity that we can move forward with him in making changes to what's bogging us down in this process. That as people who have been working for so long in this treaty process, who have an end goal in mind, the ball is there, and you're all reaching for it, that we now have an opportunity to make the change that is required to help us get there. But also the other thing that occurred to me is that we also have the provincial government that's really been dragging their ass in this thing. It was a year ago that I was leaving the chief commissioner position, and the province had then just pulled the rug out from was supposed to be the person who follows in my, after I leave, George Abbott. Very capable man. You know, there was no reason why he shouldn't have been appointed as chief commissioner. And yet the province pulled out, and they said it was because they wanted to, study the process, or I don't know. They didn't want to stay with the status quo, I think and I think that Brustad is still using that idea, that they want to change the status quo. Well, hello, we've been saying that all along, that we wanted them to change their status quo, because that's what's holding this whole thing up. Geez, I'm starting to sound like chief commissioner. I better get off. But my point was, I did have a point here. My point was that we got the feds over here, Joe Wild saying stuff. So it's a challenge for all of us. But all of us then collectively need to use that as a lever to get the province back to the table and get them moving, get them doing something. Because if the feds are prepared to look at changing the status quo, supposedly that's what the province is interested in. So let's get all the parties back together. Anyway, that's just a little bit that I thought that I would throw in there, that we do move on that, and we don't let this opportunity pass by. There's discussion, again, around from all of the tables, that we continue to have challenges around communication with each other, communication with various agencies, but I think mostly communication with each other, and how do we get the information out there. And I know how frustrating it is when you work hard, you work days and weeks on end, and then it comes to like a vote or even just a nation meeting, and everybody's bitching at you about, we didn't get that information, how come you're going ahead and doing this and we don't know anything about it. So, I've been involved in this business, and oh God, it's way too long. And it was like that when we started, back in the, holy flippin', was it really the 60s? Like a long time ago. We had trouble then, and everybody was complaining about they didn't have the information. But you know what? It was true back then. It's not true now, and we know that it's not true, and that there's lots of information, and that we do get it out there. And I guess it's just a matter of continuing to challenge people when they say they haven't got the information, to put that responsibility back on their shoulders. If they say, I didn't get that information, oh, really? Why not? Why didn't you get it? Because it was sent out to you. Why aren't you talking to your family members or whatever? But I think that, I don't know, I suppose it's going to be an age-old challenge for that we're always going to be talking about that, about having how to get citizen engagement, how to get citizen involvement and citizen buy-in. I'm really happy that there's so many of our tables that when we talk about the quote, or the old saying of off reserve, on reserve, off reserve, that in fact people now are talking about those that are at home and those that live away from home, and just using that kind of language. So much better, so much more inclusive, so much, and removing that colonial thinking. I think that is about it. I just wanted to end off by again saying that I'm very encouraged, because regardless of where our discussion takes us to, we always come back to reaffirming that this whole thing is about knowing who we are, knowing where we're going in this, I was going to say process, not a process, just in this whole experience that we have. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, and good afternoon to everybody. It's a real pleasure to be up here with Uncle Stephen here. I kind of like that, I've known him for some time now, and he says he learned from me. Well, I learned a lot from him as well. And the Harvard project, although it was in a different context and governance as we talk about it here, was very, very important in terms of as a catalyst to get people thinking in a different way. And I really appreciated our time together, Stephen, working together on different things. And Sophie, I'm glad you didn't say how long you've been doing this, because you would have dated me too. It's always a real pleasure to be in your good company. One of the people I really admire. Been a leader that's made things happen. She's not just a talker, and I really admire that. I want to just start off by acknowledging this young man that spoke after me, John Jack, because I think what he says there, what he had to say at the end of his remarks, is exactly that's the kind of legacy we need to be looking to leave. You know, our rhetoric, and I spent 2 terms as your regional chief for British Columbia, and I heard a lot of it. But one of the favorite ones is that we don't do something now that we're going to affect our people 7 generations down the road. Well, that's good, provided you have the power to affect that. And I always challenge that rhetoric, because in order to have the power to affect that, we have to be free to do it. We have to be wearing our own blanket of power, as I said this morning. Otherwise, it's just talk. And what this young man said about his daughter being the first generation of that next 7 generations to be free, I think that's, in my book, that's the ultimate legacy to be looking for. Because by doing so, you're ensuring the future well-being of all of our children. And I was really struck by that, and I thank you very much for that, John. Catherine is someone I've known for a long time. When I mentioned about Chief Joe Mathias this morning and this National Film Board thing, when he was sitting there with those tears streaming down his eyes, Catherine was sitting there also doing the same. But what I seen in her face was how much you cared for him, and how you shared his pain, and how much you supported him. And I was telling her when I ran into her, I said, you've been on my mind now for 3 weeks. Because that little interaction was something that we need to get back to. Recognizing and respecting one another and caring for each other like that. But one thing that Catherine says that I think is really, really important here, and that is that we do not have to accept the status quo anymore. As Stephen said earlier on, when we're talking about our own institutions, our own constitution, they want us to all look alike and look the same so that they can deal with it easier. And it reminded me of a time when we were battling on our territories, protecting our people in terms of their fishing rights. We'd get charged and so on, go into the court, and we'd put all the family members beside the person who was being charged, and they couldn't identify him because to them we all looked alike. So I think, the point that Catherine made there is very, very important. We don't have to accept the status quo, and we need to maintain who we are, always and at all times. The other thing that she said that I think is also very, very important is that we don't need to be negotiating our governance or the details of our government within this process. That's ours. We have the inherent right to self-govern. What does inherent mean? That means we always had it. It's not the subject of a grant from anybody. We have pre-existing sovereignty, which has survived Confederation, protected under Section 35 of the Constitution Act. And that's one of the things, that's one of the missions that we had in Delgamuukw and Gisteway, was to get that constitutional protection, and we achieved it. So that's our right. That's something that we need to do. And only we can determine the content of that full box of rights. And that's what we need to express in terms of our Constitution, our governance, and this new relationship that we're talking about here. I think one key thing that she made me think about was the notion of Aboriginal title when she said, we don't talk about it like that. We talk about it in our own language. And that is true, and we need to be reminded of that all the time. Because the court certainly can't and didn't go all the way as far as title and rights are concerned, because they couldn't understand us fully. So we need to maintain that definition according to our own language and the way we see it. And we need to organize ourselves to the point where, as the Supreme Court said in Chilcotin, that Aboriginal title can come about in two ways, either by declaration of the court or by recognition. And I believe if we organize our governance the way Catherine was talking this morning, that we can put ourselves in a position to have that recognition and not have to go back into the courts ever again. I firmly believe that. If we organize ourselves to the degree necessary, we don't need to go back into the courts. We can achieve the recognition we're looking for. And it also raised another issue, a point that came out of Chilcotin, where the court, the Supreme Court of Canada, has given guidance to the Crown as far as Aboriginal title is concerned. And it says to the Crown that they should reassess any agreements that they have with First Nations and bring them into line with title. Failure to do so can result in two things. One, the legislation can fail, and that's really amazing. We've seen in Chilcotin that the Forest Act fails. So whose jurisdiction are we talking about now? Okay. So legislation can fail, and or the Crown could lose the opportunity. And we need to take the same guidance. We need to reassess any agreements that we might have with the Crown and business and industry, and we need to bring it into line with our understanding of what our title and rights are. And I think, and I believe, that when we do our governance the way Catherine was talking about it, that we can accomplish that as well. So I really like that. Chief Joe Hall, he's gone, but I just wanted to touch on a thing about the fiscal policy he was talking about. And I think this is also a key point for us, is the whole notion of fiscal relations. I don't know if you remember Attawapiskat being in the news a few years ago. That little baby crawling on that moldy mattress and the plywood floor and a lean-to. It caused the Canadian public to take notice for the first time in a long time with the lens of empathy, not sympathy, but empathy. Understand and seen it for what it is. And Harper turned around and blamed the people of Attawapiskat. He said, well, we gave them $60 million, and they blew it, and they got this problem. It's of their own making, right? A couple of days later, one of the reporters came in and said, hey, just hang on a second here. We checked into this. You made it sound like you gave them $60 million last year. In fact, they have a multi-year agreement and I believe it was over 5 or 6 years. Following that, practically the day after that, another reporter is questioning the minister. And he says, we've been crunching the numbers. And just in Ontario alone, the fiscal transfer for education for the public is about $10,500 per person. And yet in Attawapiskat, the money that we're talking about there amounts to a little over $9,000 per person for everything. Now, there's some serious dollars there in terms of inequity. But prior to going into the Supreme Court of Canada on Delgamuukw and Gisteway, I set up a meeting with our hereditary chiefs, the Wet'suwet'en, and with a man named Tommy Shoyama, who's fondly remembered and referred to as the godfather of fiscal relations in Canada. And when he sat down with our chiefs and elders, he said to them, I can't advise you until I know what you want. So there was an amazing dialogue that was happening because Tommy Shoyama was an elder as well, a Japanese elder. And then finally he threw his hands in the air and said, oh, now I get it. You're talking about self-government. And all of our chiefs and elders, yeah, of course that's what we're talking about. He said, okay, now I can advise you. He said, the first thing is, don't give up the transfer. He said, if you want to be a government, you have to understand, first of all, how do you raise the revenue to govern? And secondly, where do you get the revenue to provide essential services to your people? He said, every government in the world, with the exception of a couple of places like Israel and Hong Kong, I think, every government in the world raises its revenue to govern and provide essential services from its lands and resources. And they do so through taxation, royalties, leases, license, permits, tenures, and so on. And when all this money is collected, there's a transfer arrangement between the federal government, the provinces, and the territories regarding essential services, infrastructure, and everything else. And then he said, there's also the notion of equalization. And in Canada, when Newfoundland came into Confederation in 1949, I believe, they came in as the poor cousin, right? They didn't really have much of an economy there. And so in terms of essential services, they set a level, an equitable level for all Canadians in terms of essential services. And if in your respective province you can't raise your share, then there's a procedure to equalize it, to top it up so you come to the same level. And what Tommy Shoyama was saying to us was, first of all, don't give up the transfer, because that's what he was seeing in negotiations at the time. Oh, we don't need it, we can do better. The point he made was that it was a right. It was a right for all Canadians, a human right. And you deserve it as much as anybody else does. So we need to maintain that relationship, and we need to equalize. And the reason why we need to pay attention to the fiscal side of it is just simply the fact of how are we going to govern and how are we going to provide essential services to our people. It's the key aspect of governance. And we need to remember to see it that way. And Sophie was talking, she underlined the fact and the importance of the people, that we need to go to our people. And I think that was the best advice I've ever heard regarding this challenge. And that is, that we should take as much time as necessary. Time shouldn't be a factor in terms of when we're dealing with our people. We move when they're ready. And if we look at it like that, then we're going to take as much time as is necessary. And I think that's, if there's any advice that can be given as far as constitutional making and building is concerned, that's the best advice. The other point that I think that comes out of Sophie's presentation was that we have to understand that when we're talking about constitutional building, it's not the norm as far as the world is concerned. You know, when the British North America Act was put in place in 1867 to create Canada, did they go out and talk to their people? When the U.S. Constitution was put in place, did they go out and talk to their people? No, they didn't. For the most part, nation constitutions around the world were written in a room with usually a bunch of white men and imposed on the people. Here, what we're talking about is starting with our people. And I think the difference is it's from our culture and it's from our tradition. The collective way in which we see ourselves, the collective way in which we hold our lands and resources, and the collective way in which we govern. There's a fundamental difference there. And we need to always remind our people of that fact. That what we're doing, when you look at it like this, is unique. It's unique, it's powerful, and it's ours. So I really appreciated that, Sophie. And then from the comments from the reports coming in, there's one thing that was raised that was how do you reconcile between democracy or being democratic and the hereditary system? I think when you really look at this, the whole notion of democracy, the true essence of it is within our own systems. Where do you think the whole notion of democracy came from? It came from the Haudenosaunee, the U.S. Constitution. There was no accident that the U.S. Constitution was written by these white guys in Albany, New York. That's Haudenosaunee lands. And that's where they got it. So I'm not sure how that was meant, but what I want to underline is the fact that when we talk about democracy, what we've been told for the last couple of decades is that our own traditional systems aren't. We've been questioned. And we need to realize and understand that they are. And if anybody wants to talk about it, if anybody wants to see real democracy in action, come into our potlatch hall, come into our longhouse, and we'll teach you a thing or two. The other thing that came from CJ in his presentation, I really like this, and that is that we need to start using freedom language, not colonial jargon, our own language. And I want to get also back to Joe Wild. He said they want to eradicate colonialism. Yeah, I'll give him the first stick he needs to do that, because that's what we got to do. We got to decolonize Canada. And when we look at our political organizations, we need to start with decolonizing the Minister of Indian Affairs and that big, huge democracy or bureaucracy that's there to hold us down. There's nothing that says Section 9124 needs to be the Indian Act. It could just as easily be a piece of recognition legislation. So when you want to, how did he say it? Unlearn. It's one thing to unlearn all about me as a person. It's another thing to untie me so I can be free. So they can learn all they want, but if they don't put it in practice, it doesn't make any difference. But I, like Sophie, was encouraged by his remarks. That's something, that we're not used to hearing, that we haven't heard. We want to eradicate colonialism. That's pretty amazing. And he talks about it in terms of the Truth and Reconciliation report. And we've also, it was a great piece of work. But I think we need to connect also the reconciliation that arises from our title and rights. Because the reconciliation that arises in the context of our title and rights is enforceable. It's constitutionally and legally enforceable. The recommendations coming out of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission are recommendatory. They're not enforceable in the same way. So that they depend on the political goodwill, which our current Prime Minister has committed to. So he said that they will implement all of those recommendations. So what I'm saying here is that we've got to combine the two. The reconciliation in terms of our government-to-government relationship and the reconciliation in terms of our relationship with the public and the society at large, because that's what that's about. The last point I want to make is just with respect to Section 35. This is a conversation that Stephen and I were having going up to Beardy First Nation in Saskatchewan. And we're talking about sovereignty. And in the United States, you've got this notion of domestic dependent sovereignty, and which arises out of the Indian Reorganization Act, right? And Marshall and so on, right? Anyway, I said, that doesn't hold up when you come across the border, and we got to be clear about that, because here we're talking about pre-existent sovereignty, which is not the subject of a grant from anybody. And I think that we have to pay attention to the fundamental differences and distinctions when we're talking about Section 35 in our own context, because that was created and put in place by our leaders. I look back on it and I'm amazed at their vision and their courage. Like, how did they foresee this? It's amazing. And finally, I used to teach a course in organizational theory, and one of the things I learned there is if you want to be a motorcycle gang, you don't use the organizational structure of a church. You want to have a good sawmill, you don't structure it like a car dealership. And similarly with government. If you want to build a good government, then don't build it on the Indian Act, because that is not ours. So I think just in terms of that, the biggest thing about change in any organization is that you have to change the culture. And that's our challenge too, is we have to change the culture of the Indian Act, that dysfunctional culture, back to exercising our own culture. Then we're on the road to success. Thank you very much.
Good job. Thank you all very much. We have a few minutes. Does anybody have any burning questions for any of our panel members? Everybody's pretty tired today. I want to say thank you very much to all three of you for the attention that you paid all day, listening to the words that people said and to helping us to put them into the context of the work that we're doing within our communities. It's very important, and we look forward to seeing all of you tomorrow as well and to doing this again tomorrow. I think it's a really great exercise to be able to reflect back on some of the things that we've heard and to hear that through the minds of people who have got so much experience in this area and who admittedly continue to learn from all of us who are working on the ground. So we really appreciate that as well.